The top business stories live from the Sky Newsroom. Canada warns it won't back down as the country announces reciprocal tariffs against the United States. How will Donald Trump's 25% levy impact the steel industry? Here, we'll be speaking to the head of UK Steel. But there is better news for President Trump and the US economy, with inflation falling by more than expected. Very good afternoon on this Wednesday, Business Live with me, Darren McCaffrey. Just to say that obviously the Irish Prime Minister, the Taoiseach Micheál Martin, is in. My screen's gone to black, but I'm going to talk about him being in the White House, and we'll bring you coverage of that St. Patrick's Day reception with President Trump from the Oval Office, probably at some point this half hour. I want to turn to this camera now, just so we don't have that black screen behind me. And I'm going to talk about Canada and tariffs, because that is our main story this afternoon, as they have announced a retaliatory 25% tariffs on the United States on a range of goods with nearly 30 billion Canadian dollars. It is all in response to the steel and aluminium levy introduced by the United States, of course, overnight. Well, a delegation from Ottawa will travel to Washington, D.C. later this week in an attempt to calm the prospect of an all-out trade war. But Canada's foreign minister has warned that her country will not back down and will not give in. Meanwhile, here in the UK, well, it's resisted the temptation to join Canada and the EU in imposing tariffs on the United States. The Prime Minister's promised to be pragmatic, but added all options remain on the table when it comes to tariffs, with a 25% levy on steel now in effect. So how will it affect the industry here? Well, our business and economics correspondent, Gurpreet Narwan, has more on that.
The UK government, as you pointed out, has said that it's not going to retaliate against Donald Trump. And if we look at the data, well, it might give us a clue as to how government ministers are thinking. This is the total market for our iron and steel exports. And as you can see, the US, it's our second largest market for exports of iron and steel, dwarfed by the EU, but still worth 8%. And 400 million, it's not insignificant, but it's worth putting that figure in some broader context. This is our total exports to the US. So if we look at everything that we export to the US, and here you can see, well, makes up just a minuscule fraction of that. Iron and steel coming in at just 0.68%. Actually, it's cars that are more significant, 15% of the total. That is a much bigger deal. And these figures do matter because the UK government is hoping that it can slip into the background and bring Donald Trump to the negotiating table. And if Donald Trump were looking at these charts, if he were surveying these charts, he might look on the UK favourably, because this is the imports of steel to the US. And as you can see, the UK, it's not a big player. The EU, on the other hand, 15% of all the imports that come to the US of steel, they are in third place. The UK, well, it's not in the top 10. It's actually way out in 15th place. There you go, 1%. And it's a similar story for aluminium. Again, the EU in third place with 5%. And the UK, well, it's an even smaller fraction this time, all the way out there in 17th place, 0.4%. So all of this may give you an indication of why the UK government may feel that there are bigger battles to fight.
We're just going to interrupt the tariff story for 1 second to bring some breaking news, and that is that the UK say they are revoking accreditation for a Russian diplomat and a diplomatic spouse here in the UK. Now, the UK say they are revoking that because they think it is clear that Russia is trying to drive what they say is the British embassy in Moscow towards closure. In fact, we've just had a statement in from a Foreign Office spokesperson. I'll read it to you, saying that during the past 12 months, Russia has pursued an increasingly aggressive and coordinated campaign of harassment against British diplomats, pumping out malicious and completely baseless accusations about the work. Russia's expulsion this week of a British diplomat and diplomatic spouse is yet another escalation. The accusations made against these individuals are entirely false, fabricated in order to justify their increasing harassment of UK diplomats It is clear that the Russian state is actively seeking to drive the British embassy in Moscow towards closure and has no regard for the dangerous escalatory impact of this. And they have summoned the Russian ambassador today. A senior Foreign Office official apparently made it clear that the UK will not stand for intimidation of British embassy staff or their families. Consequently, we are taking immediate reciprocal action, revoking accreditation for a Russian diplomat and a diplomatic spouse. We do not, this is the Foreign Office, take this decision lightly, but we have always made clear to Russia that if they escalate, we will take reciprocal action. The depths to which Russia sinks can only be met through strength. It goes on to say, despite the extremely difficult bilateral relations caused by Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine and the long-running campaign of hostile action against the UK government believes that maintaining diplomatic channels of communication and a respective diplomatic missions is important. It is deeply disappointing that this is continually made more difficult by unprovoked action from Russia. And this statement from the Foreign Office concludes by saying, we have drawn a line under this incident and we demand Russia do the same. Any further action taken by Russia will be considered an escalation and responded to accordingly. So quite a robust statement there from the Foreign Office, essentially accusing the Russians of trying to close the British embassy, if you like, in Moscow. We know there was the expulsion of 2 more British diplomats earlier on this week. Clearly, the UK has felt the need to reciprocate. And it is also clear that Russian relations are at a very, very low ebb, just at a time in which the United States is trying to, or attempting to, rebuild those relations. They're going in the opposite direction when it comes to the UK and Russia, with the Russian ambassador to the UK called to the Foreign Office today. We'll have more on that story about the expulsion of those 2 Russian diplomats a little later on in the programme. Let's now, though, return to the story, if we can, about tariffs, steel here in the UK. Let's speak to Gareth Stace. He is Director General of UK Steel. Gareth, very good afternoon to you. Just to focus on the impact here in the UK, your reaction to the US's decision to impose these tariffs?
Well, the imposition of tariffs on all British-made steel that we export to the UK economy by the US administration this morning was deeply disappointing. President Trump, I would have thought, would realise and see quite clearly that we're his friend, not his foe. And our customers in the US, our valued customers that we sell our steel to, we see them as partners. And I hope they would never see us as an enemy. So we want to work with the American administration and President Trump to get to the bottom of this, find a solution, because we're in the same boat as the US with rising imports and worried about global overcapacity of steel.
That is true. Are you then happy that the UK government effectively have decided at the moment, and the Prime Minister said nothing is off the table, but to impose retaliatory tariffs? You think that is helpful?
Well, as we can see from, Gurpreet, what you were saying, and you were saying before, was this is a very fast-moving story, and therefore what I'm hoping, and I truly believe that our government is working at pace, night and day, to speak and get in touch with and working with the US administration to find a solution to the tariffs. So what we want to see is a full exemption for British-made steel from those tariffs. I know that government is working towards that, but equally other countries are taking a bolder action and very swift action. So, let's understand how quickly this whole issue is moving and react accordingly.
In saying that, there'll be people point out that we have tariffs. I mean, we have retaliatory tariffs in place in the UK. They're here until at least next year. So maybe it is not. Is it that bad? I suppose the United States have done this. I mean, they're trying to protect our steel and aluminium industry. We've done the same over the last couple of decades, have we not?
Well, let me tell you why we have safeguard tariffs in the UK at the moment. We put them in place after President Trump brought in steel tariffs in 2018 as a direct response. The UK steel sector and the UK government doesn't want to see tariffs here and tariffs there and safeguards. We want free and fair trade. But once particular countries and certain countries put up tariffs, other countries put up tariffs, and before we know it, everyone has tariffs, and we have a very protectionist steel sector globally. We don't want to see that. So that's why we need to keep a cool head now and find a common solution, because everything that President Trump is citing of why he's putting these tariffs in place, we in the UK are suffering exactly the same, as I said, through rising imports. Imports account for 68% of UK steel demand. It's a very unsustainable figure, and that has risen up from 2 years ago when it was 50%. As I said, we're concerned with a massive steel overcapacity of production of steel in the world globally of something like 500 million tons of steel. We make only 5 million tons of steel in the UK. So you can see why that global overcapacity could easily flood our market, and flood our market even more from this morning when those US tariffs came into place, because the steel won't go there now to the US. It'll have to go somewhere else, and it can easily come to the UK shores and swamp our market and really, damage our sector and put jobs at risk.
But just finally on this, Gareth, we've heard, haven't we, that the UK steel industry is not in a good shape. Again, has not been for quite a long period of time. What's the solution to all this? I mean, I cannot see. I mean, we've seen Donald Trump ebb and flow on tariffs with many different countries in the last couple of weeks alone, but he has been pretty consistent, even in his first term, on tariffs on steel and aluminium. What is the answer for British Steel here to make itself sustainable, to make itself grow, to maybe make itself find new markets elsewhere, and where would they be?
Well, firstly, what we want is a competitive business environment to work in. Our energy costs are 50% higher than France and Germany. That makes us very uncompetitive. It's so difficult to compete, even in the UK and Europe, let alone globally. We also need, to work with government to help it deliver on its forthcoming steel strategy. It's made a bold move there. The government is saying it's going to invest £2.5 billion in our sector over the next 10 years. But that steel strategy, as I said, has to be bold. It has to look at how we can be more competitive on energy prices, how the government can purchase more steel from the UK rather than import the steel that it purchases. But also, thinking about today, the government needs to bolster and strengthen trade defences here in the UK to stop that tsunami of steel that's waiting to come to our country, because it won't be able to go to the US and soon won't be able to go to Europe, because Europe is acting fast to bolster its own trade defences. So government need to act quickly here, because it is, as I said, a very fast-moving situation.
OK, Gareth, really appreciate your time this afternoon. That's Gareth Stace there from UK Steel. Thank you on, of course, those imports. They're going to be placed on steel from the UK and elsewhere around the world, being imposed on those steel makers, imposed by Donald Trump. And as I said, we are expecting to hear from Donald Trump in the Oval Office in the next couple of minutes here on Sky as he meets the Irish Prime Minister. But let's talk about the US economy if we can, because markets have seen trillions of dollars wiped off their value since the tariff tit-for-tat started in earnest. But there was better news for the American economy this afternoon, with inflation falling further than expected to 2.8% last month. Let's speak to George Lagares, Chief Economist at Forrest Mazars. Thank you very much indeed, George, for joining us. And there was a little bit of good news today on the inflation front.
Yes, so inflation came in slightly lower than expected. Of course, it doesn't reflect really anything, okay? That's just the initial reading of February's inflation, so tariffs are not really part of this. If anything, it probably reflects a little bit more sluggish demand than anticipated and lower energy prices at the time. It's the forward numbers that will matter a lot more, especially for the Fed.
It is indeed, but we've seen a market reaction, haven't we? And it's, again, quite positive.
Yeah, well, that's a market that's been selling off relentlessly for the past week and a half, so some respite is welcome.
It is welcome, but ultimately, what's your view on what we've seen in the last week and a half, as you said? Is this just a correction, something that actually the White House seems pretty relaxed about? Or is there genuine concern? I mean, is this something that's potentially going to carry on about the state of the US economy? I read earlier that you do not think it's in necessarily as bad a shape as some have suggested.
Yes. So, look, part of it is an overdue correction. This was a monothematic US equity market, and a lot of it now is rotating to emerging markets tech, Europe, defense, defensive, and value. Okay, and that's fine. And also there is a reversion of the carry trade, weaker USD, stronger yen, which helps this movement. And of course, there are some worries, and some of them may be justified, but the numbers today are not flashing red, and we need to be clear about this. The numbers today show macroeconomic volatility, but they do not spell recession. It could come later if trade wars persist, if uncertainty persists, then we could see a recession. Okay, we cannot take it off the table. But with the numbers we have today, we simply cannot call a recession.
But in saying that, you talk about uncertainty. Isn't that definitive, if you like, what Donald Trump is all about? Hence why he was even willing to use the word a couple of days ago.
Yes, but so that's a question. Can he keep up that level of uncertainty for the next 4 years? If he does, then we should expect a high probability of a global economic downturn at some point. Okay, there are no two questions about it. But if at some point we do see where this thing is headed, then markets might at least make peace with that and go towards a new direction. And the thing with Mr. Trump is the uncertainty. We cannot even be certain about the uncertainty.
That's the key point, isn't it? As lots of my guests have been saying over the last couple of days, they've no real idea what's happening in Donald Trump's head. But we're going to have to leave it there, George. Thank you very much for your time.